In late 1942, during the brutal fight for Guadalcanal, Imperial Japanese intelligence intercepted a series of crystal-clear American radio transmissions. There was no jamming. Yet, as Tokyo's elite cryptanalysts analyzed the pristine audio, they hit an absolute dead end. The intercepted voices spoke with a complex syntax and distinct tonality that matched no linguistic database in the Japanese Empire. These were veteran codebreakers who had successfully cracked other Allied ciphers, but now they possessed perfect audio and zero comprehension. Hearing every syllable perfectly, but unable to extract a single tactical advantage, Japanese command faced a chilling question. What exactly were the Americans broadcasting? The answer wasn't a machine, but a deeply complex oral tradition weaponized into a highly secure, two-layered military protocol. Popular post-war myths often suggest that simply speaking Navajo over the radio was enough to confuse the enemy. The historical reality is far more rigorous. This system was designed so intricately that even when Imperial forces eventually managed to capture a native Navajo soldier and force him to listen to the American broadcasts, the actual operational meaning of the messages remained entirely locked away from him. The true ingenuity lay in the transformation, taking a raw, unwritten language and forging it into a standardized, lightning-fast cryptographic tool that left no paper trail for the enemy to seize. But to understand how this unprecedented protocol completely blinded Tokyo's intelligence network, we first have to examine the severe, almost catastrophic communications crisis the United States military faced during the opening months of the Pacific War. In early 1942, the Pacific Theater was a graveyard of American tactical communications. Following the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent invasions of the Philippines and Wake Island, the United States Marine Corps learned a brutal lesson in signals intelligence. The Imperial Japanese military possessed a highly sophisticated and aggressively efficient radio interception network. Their forward listening posts were staffed by operators who had often been educated in the United States or the United Kingdom. These monitors spoke flawless English, understood American slang, and were listening to standard Marine Corps frequencies around the clock. Whenever a pinned-down American unit broadcasted an urgent request for artillery support or a change in coordinates using plain English, Japanese intelligence officers were translating the orders almost simultaneously. They used this real-time information to shift their mortar fire, ambush advancing patrols, and outmaneuver American forces before the tactical orders could even be fully executed on the ground. Broadcasting over open airwaves had become a direct liability, essentially handing the operational playbook directly to the enemy command. Yet, maintaining total radio silence was impossible. The geography of the Pacific War dictated a completely new, fluid style of combat. Unlike the static, muddy trenches of the First World War, where miles of heavy telephone wire could be safely buried underground, the dense, triple-canopy jungles of islands like Guadalcanal and Bougainville made hardline communications a logistical nightmare. Wire strung through the dense foliage was routinely severed by artillery shrapnel, crushed by retreating armor, or deliberately cut by Japanese infiltration units in the dead of night. To coordinate naval gunfire, direct close air support, and synchronize the movements of scattered infantry platoons fighting blindly through thick vegetation, Marine commanders absolutely relied on portable two-way radios like the SCR-300 backpack transceiver. They desperately needed instantaneous communication to survive. The United States military did, of course, possess advanced mechanical encryption. The standard issue cipher machine for tactical units was the M209, a mechanical rotor-based device designed by the Swedish cryptographer Boris Hagelin. It was a brilliantly engineered piece of equipment, but in the middle of a chaotic firefight, it became a deadly bottleneck. To send a secure message using the M209, A communications officer had to painstakingly type the message letter by letter, rotating a series of pin and lug wheels to generate a coded text. This encrypted cipher then had to be read over the radio via phonetic alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, by a radio man. On the receiving end, the entire grueling process had to be reversed. Under ideal, perfectly calm conditions, encrypting, transmitting, and decrypting a basic 3-line operational order could take up to 30 minutes. In the brutal, close-quarters environment of a Pacific jungle assault, a 30-minute delay was catastrophic. If a Marine rifle company was taking heavy machine gun fire and called for immediate artillery extraction coordinates, a half-hour wait meant the enemy would overrun their position long before the shells ever arrived. If commanders bypassed the machines and used manual substitution ciphers, known as the shackle code, operators had to frantically look up alphanumeric grids in paper codebooks while bullets tore through the canopy above them. The paper books themselves presented a massive security risk. If an operator was killed and his codebook was captured by a Japanese patrol, the entire network security was compromised until the cryptographic keys could be physically changed across the entire Pacific Fleet. Desperate radiomen sometimes resorted to using heavy regional dialects, profanity, or obscure American cultural references in an attempt to confuse Japanese listeners. But Tokyo's intelligence officers quickly adapted, analyzing the traffic and breaking the makeshift slang within days. The United States military was caught in a lethal paradox. They faced the absolute tactical necessity of instantaneous voice-to-voice radio communication, pitted directly against the catastrophic security risk of speaking in plain English. The Marines required a cryptographic system that possessed the impenetrable mathematical security of a rotor machine, but operated at the exact speed of a human voice shouting frantically into a microphone. It was a logistical impossibility that the highest levels of the War Department had failed to solve. And it was exactly this desperately narrow operational gap that prompted an unconventional, highly experimental proposal from an aging veteran of the First World War. That veteran was Philip Johnston. The son of a Protestant missionary, Johnston had grown up on a Navajo reservation in the American Southwest and was one of the rare outsiders fluent in the complex, unwritten indigenous language. In early 1942, he secured a meeting with Major General Clayton B. Vogel of the Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet. Johnston pitched a radical idea: use Navajo as a secure voice-to-voice cipher. It was a tonal language with no alphabet and absolutely no written documentation that Japanese intelligence could ever steal. Vogel authorized a preliminary test under simulated combat conditions. The transmission speed was incredibly fast, but the exercise instantly revealed a critical, almost fatal limitation. When untrained native speakers were placed in front of military radios and ordered to translate tactical English messages directly into Navajo, the system collapsed into massive operational confusion. The problem was the reality of modern industrial warfare colliding with an ancient vocabulary. The Navajo language naturally possessed no terminology for the mechanized machinery of the Second World War. There were no words for a dive bomber, a motorized infantry battalion, or specific calibers of artillery. When a native speaker tried to translate a rapid-fire order regarding an armored column, he was forced to improvise a lengthy, subjective description. The speaker on the receiving end then had to interpret that improvised phrase back into English. The result was mistranslation and fatal ambiguity. If 3 different radiomen used 3 different phrases to describe a mortar barrage, battlefield coordination would rapidly disintegrate. Raw language, no matter how obscure to the enemy, was not enough to run a modern war. In fact, Unregulated native fluency actually created tactical chaos. Commanders quickly realized they faced a structural wall. They couldn't simply hand microphones to Navajo recruits and expect them to direct a Pacific assault. If this experimental network was going to survive actual combat, the military had to do more than just speak an indigenous tongue. They had to deliberately engineer a strict, standardized cryptographic layer, a rigid, weaponized code hidden entirely inside the unwritten language itself. To forge this cryptographic layer, the Marine Corps initiated a highly classified and unprecedented project in May of 1942. The military recruited 29 young Navajo men, many of whom had never left the boundaries of their reservation in the American Southwest. The profound irony of their recruitment was not lost on them. Many of these same men had been forced into government-run boarding schools as children, where they were aggressively punished, sometimes physically beaten, simply for speaking their native tongue. Now, the United States government was placing the entire tactical security of the Pacific theater squarely on their linguistic fluency. They were sworn in and immediately transported to Camp Elliott, a sprawling, sun-baked Marine Corps training facility situated just north of San Diego, California. But instead of being sent to standard infantry maneuver training or artillery schools, these 29 recruits were completely isolated from the rest of the armed forces. They were ushered into a secured, heavily guarded barracks, placed in front of large, blank chalkboards, and handed a seemingly impossible logistical task. They were ordered to engineer an entirely new, unwritten military vocabulary from scratch, and they had to execute this linguistic invention in a matter of weeks. The first critical hurdle they faced was the problem of spelling. Even with a specialized, pre-agreed vocabulary for weapons and tactics, there would always be a strict operational need to transmit proper nouns, the names of specific commanding officers, unique geographical locations, or newly minted operational code names. They needed a phonetic alphabet. Because the Navajo language had no native alphabet, the recruits solved this by engineering a bilingual bridge. They assigned a specific English word to a Navajo word, relying entirely on the first letter of the English translation to signify the letter they needed. For the letter A, they chose the Navajo word Walachi, which means ant. For the letter B, they selected shush, meaning bear. For C, they used moshi, meaning cat. Under this new system, if a radio man in the field needed to spell the surname Smith, he would rapidly broadcast the Navajo words for sheep, mouse, ice, turkey, and horse. It was a brilliant, unbreakable spelling mechanism, but the recruits quickly realized that an alphabet alone was dangerously, fatally slow. In the heat of combat, spelling out a phrase like heavy artillery barrage, letter by letter under suppressing machine gun fire, would get Marines killed while they waited for the transmission to end. To achieve the necessary speed, they needed a massive database of direct substitutions. The true operational velocity of the code would rely entirely on this secondary layer, a massive, pre-agreed dictionary of direct linguistic substitutions. The 29 original recruits were tasked with engineering direct Navajo replacements for the rigid, mechanized industrial jargon of the American military machine. Sitting in their locked rooms at Camp Elliott, they systematically analyzed a comprehensive list of standard military terms, matching them creatively to the natural world of the Navajo reservation. A submarine, an entirely foreign concept to the desert-dwelling recruits, became bishlu, translating literally to iron fish. A hand grenade became nimasi, or potato. A fighter plane, characterized by its rapid, darting aerial movements, was designated dahetihi, the hummingbird. An observation plane, hovering quietly above the battlefield, became the owl, neastya. A massive, heavily armored battleship was categorized simply as lotso, the whale. They went further, assigning Navajo clan names to represent different military units, and native bird names to denote specific officer ranks. Over several weeks of grueling, intense linguistic engineering, they built a comprehensive 411-term dictionary that covered everything from specific calibers of ammunition to complex flanking maneuvers. But simply creating the words was only the first phase of the operation. The true test was absolute mental discipline. This was not a loose improvisational language where a speaker could guess a translation or use a synonym. It was a strict, unforgiving military cipher. Every single Navajo recruit had to memorize the entire 411-term dictionary with absolute zero margin for error perfection. In the chaotic, deafening environment of a Pacific firefight, if a radio man forgot the specific engineered term for a mortar and mistakenly used the word for standard heavy artillery, the resulting coordinate strike would hit the wrong grid, potentially wiping out their own advancing infantry. The training regimen was relentless. Instructors drilled the vocabulary into their minds day and night, simulating combat stress, until the translation from English military jargon to Navajo code was instantaneous, automatic, and flawless. Yet the greatest, most devastating tactical advantage of this newly minted dictionary was precisely its physical non-existence. When the first echelon of these highly trained Navajo Code Talkers was deployed to the Pacific Theater, stepping off Higgins boats into the suffocating, malaria-ridden jungles of Guadalcanal, they carried absolutely no cryptographic manuals. A standard communications officer deploying with the mechanical N209 cipher machine was burdened with heavy metal rotors, intricate mechanical maintenance kits, and highly classified printed paper codebooks that had to be guarded with his life, often requiring him to destroy the materials with thermite grenades if capture was imminent. The Navajo radiomen, by stark contrast, carried only their standard-issue M1 Garand rifles and the heavy, battery-powered SCR-300 backpack transceivers strapped to their shoulders. The entire cryptographic cipher was stored safely and exclusively inside the neural pathways of their own minds. This biological cryptography allowed Marine commanders to execute complex tactical maneuvers with a speed that completely altered the geometry of the battlefield. A dense, multi-stage operational order detailing an artillery bombardment, a flanking infantry advance, and an immediate casualty extraction point, which previously required up to 30 agonizing minutes to encrypt, transmit, and decrypt mechanically, was now being broadcasted, received, and perfectly understood in roughly 20 seconds. Marine commanders could suddenly maneuver fluidly in the dense jungle foliage, shouting orders directly over open radio airwaves without fear, coordinating massive division-level movements while standing waist-deep in a swamp, all without leaving a single trace of a paper trail for the enemy to exploit. If a Navajo radioman was tragically killed in action or overrun and captured by a Japanese patrol, the Imperial forces gained absolutely no intelligence advantage. There was no physical codebook to steal, no cipher machine to reverse engineer, and no mathematical key to uncover. The entire cryptographic network simply evaporated the moment the operator stopped breathing. But across the vast, contested expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the sudden, unannounced eruption of these rapid, bizarre radio transmissions was triggering intense alarms within the headphones of Imperial Japanese intelligence. The Japanese Signals Intelligence Network, operating from heavily fortified forward listening posts in Rabaul and massive naval intelligence hubs scattered across the Pacific, was widely considered one of the most sophisticated and efficient in the world. They had spent the early months of the war easily anticipating American maneuvers, casually translating plain English broadcasts, and shifting their forces to counter every Marine advance. But suddenly, the specific tactical frequencies they were monitoring were flooded with something entirely alien. Initially, the Japanese intercept operators manning the headsets assumed the Americans had finally deployed a new, highly advanced mechanical scrambling device. The audio crackling through the heavy static of their receivers possessed a complex guttural tonality and a rapid, breathless syntax that sounded entirely unnatural to ears trained exclusively on English and standard European languages. Japanese intelligence officers began meticulously recording these strange transmissions onto magnetic wire recorders, capturing every syllable. They ran the captured audio through intensive acoustic analysis, desperately searching for the telltale signs of a machine, the predictable, repeating mathematical patterns of a rotor-based cipher, the mechanical clipping of an electronic scrambler, or the rhythmic gear slips of an automated encryption unit. But their oscilloscopes and audio technicians revealed a terrifying truth. There were no mechanical patterns. There were natural human breath pauses, slight vocal hesitations, and the undeniable inflections of human emotion driven by battlefield adrenaline. It wasn't a machine at all. It was a highly coordinated, lightning-fast tactical network of human voices operating fluidly in the middle of heavy combat. This realization sent a massive wave of alarm through the Japanese command structure. They were listening to entire American Marine divisions coordinate devastating artillery strikes and massive troop movements right in front of them, yet they were completely, utterly powerless to understand a single directive. The operational advantage had violently shifted. Recognizing that they were dealing with an organic, unrecorded language, Tokyo escalated the crisis, bypassing regional commanders and handing the intercepts directly to the highest echelons of their military intelligence apparatus. The magnetic wire recordings of the intercepted American broadcasts were swiftly transported back to the imperial capital. Tokyo assigned its most elite cryptanalysts and top-tier linguists to crack the audio. These were highly educated professionals, many of whom had spent years studying in the finest universities in the United States. They were intimately familiar with American regional dialects, military slang, colloquialisms, and even obscure linguistic subsets. They sat in highly secure intelligence rooms in Tokyo, endlessly rewinding and replaying the guttural, tonal bursts of Navajo speech, struggling to find a recognizable linguistic anchor. After weeks of exhaustive, tireless analysis, the Japanese linguists successfully isolated the vocal patterns, confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were dealing with a distinct, complex human language. They even began to mathematically deduce the operational context of the broadcasts based on the exact timing of the intercepts. They noted with rising frustration that whenever a specific sequence of these alien sounds was broadcast on a particular frequency, a devastating American artillery barrage usually impacted their positions within minutes. They completely understood the rhythm of the enemy's operations, but the literal translation remained an impenetrable, frustrating fortress. And here, the true genius of the American double-layered code proved its absolute lethality. The system was designed so perfectly that even if a brilliant Japanese linguist had miraculously identified the language as Navajo, and even if they somehow acquired a standard pre-war Navajo to English dictionary from an American university, the intercepts would still be entirely useless to them. If Japanese intelligence translated the intercepted audio literally, word for word, they would hear an American radio man urgently requesting a whale to drop potatoes on an iron fish. The secondary cryptographic layer, the tactical substitutions engineered by those first 29 recruits in the locked rooms of Camp Elliott, ensured that a direct translation yielded only surreal, disjointed nonsense. The Japanese analysts were entirely trapped in a state of blind, tactical reaction. Ground commanders across the Pacific were forced to make desperate defensive decisions based solely on the mere presence of the radio traffic, completely locked out of the tactical meaning hidden within it. The mounting frustration of Tokyo's elite intelligence officers seemed destined to last for the duration of the entire Pacific War, cementing their complete blindness to American maneuvers. But their fortunes seemingly changed when the chaotic, unpredictable reality of jungle combat delivered them an unexpected, almost miraculous intelligence asset. A man who actually spoke the exact language they had been so desperately recording. Post-war legends often suggest that the Japanese military never captured a Navajo native or understood a single syllable of the language. Documented history, however, sharply contradicts this myth. The Imperial Army did, in fact, acquire the biological key to the language. His name was Joe Kiyomiya. A Navajo soldier serving in the 200th Coast Artillery, Kiyomiya had been captured in the Philippines in 1942, surviving the brutal Bataan Death March. Crucially, he was entirely disconnected from the top-secret Code Talker program back in California. He was simply a native speaker fighting in a standard artillery unit. Japanese intelligence officers, recognizing his heritage, dragged Kiyomiya into an interrogation room in Nagasaki. Under severe physical duress, they forced him to listen to the magnetic wire recordings of the intercepted marine radio traffic. They demanded a translation, believing they had finally cracked the American tactical network. Kiyomiya listened to the crackling audio and accurately identified the words being spoken. He could hear his native tongue clearly, but the moment he translated the literal words for his captors, the interrogation hit a surreal wall. He told the Japanese officers that the Americans were frantically talking about sick birds, ironfish, and turtles. Because Kiyomiya lacked the classified cryptographic training engineered at Camp Elliott, the secondary layer of military substitutions remained completely invisible to him. The strings of random, natural vocabulary made absolutely no operational sense. The Japanese possessed the biological key to the language, but without the linguistic key to the cipher, they gleaned zero tactical intelligence. The captors and the captive were left equally frustrated. The dual-layer security had held up under brutal, direct interrogation, but its ultimate logistical and psychological stress test awaited on the deadliest volcanic island of the Pacific Campaign. In February 1945, the entire cryptographic system faced its absolute limit on the black ash beaches of Iwo Jima. The amphibious assault was a scene of catastrophic physical destruction. Japanese artillery networks, deeply entrenched in the volcanic rock of Mount Suribachi, rained relentless, highly accurate fire down on the American landing zones. Standard marine communication lines were instantly pulverized. Telephone wire laid in the sand was blown apart within minutes of being spooled out. And infantry runners carrying written orders were entirely pinned down by sweeping machine gun fire. In this environment of total mechanical and physical breakdown, the tactical cohesion of the invasion fell squarely onto the shoulders of just 6 Navajo Code Talkers. Operating out of shallow foxholes amidst the deafening roar of explosions, extreme fatigue, and mounting casualties all around them, these 6 men worked continuously through the critical first 48 hours of the assault. They functioned as the central nervous system of the Marine advance. With physical codebooks rendered completely useless by the sheer chaos of the landing, the operators relied entirely on their unbroken mental discipline. Working around the clock, they transmitted and received over 800 highly classified messages. Through the crackle of their heavy backpack radios, they directed devastating naval gunfire from the offshore armada, coordinated desperately needed logistical drops of ammunition and medical supplies, and synchronized the agonizingly slow advance of infantry platoons inching up the volcanic slopes. The speed of their communication was near instantaneous, cutting through the fog of war faster than any mechanical cipher could ever allow. The Japanese defenders possessed the geographical high ground and the heavy guns, but they were fundamentally blind to the American command structure. In a brutal environment where physical communication lines were inevitably severed and printed code books would have been a fatal operational liability, this purely biological, mental protocol secured the Marines' tactical momentum. It stands as the definitive answer to why Tokyo's elite intelligence apparatus failed from the very start. The frustrated Japanese intelligence officers sitting in their listening posts in Rabaul and Tokyo did not fail because they lacked technical cryptanalytic skill. These were the same elite professionals who had successfully shattered other complex mechanical ciphers across the theater. Their failure was fundamental to the nature of their craft. Traditional cryptanalysis relies entirely on the inherent vulnerability of the machine. It demands a mathematical sequence to reverse engineer, a predictable electronic pattern to isolate, or a printed cipher book pulled from the wreckage of a battlefield. The American tactical network offered none of these mechanical weaknesses. By flawlessly merging an ancient, unwritten cultural heritage with a grueling, highly disciplined military training regimen, the Marine Corps completely bypassed the fatal flaws of industrialized encryption. It was a direct, unseen collision between the mechanical, mathematical nature of traditional code breaking and the biological vault of the human mind. Imperial forces could intercept pristine audio. They could capture a native speaker like Joe Kiyomiya and force him to listen. They could even mathematically deduce the precise timing of an impending artillery strike based purely on the volume of radio traffic. But the operational core of the American strategy remained completely impenetrable. The system worked precisely because it could not be stolen, copied, or dismantled by engineers. The code was ultimately unbreakable because its true cipher was never printed on a paper grid or stamped into a metal rotor. It was stored securely and exclusively within the human brain. Ultimately, it remains the great cryptographic paradox of the conflict. The most effective tactical encryption system used by the United States military during the Pacific War was not an advanced machine built in a laboratory, but a living, breathing language. This oral tradition was successfully weaponized by the very indigenous people that the American government, only decades earlier, had actively tried to erase from existence.